The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped inside a cream-colored envelope with gold cursive lettering that smelled faintly of jasmine. Patricia Harmon stood in her hallway in her bathrobe, coffee growing cold in her hand, reading the same 6 words over and over again. Had almost convinced herself none of it had ever happened. Not the marriage, not the house, not the life she had built brick by careful brick with a man she once believed was the safest place she had ever known. And now this. A wedding invitation. Her ex-husband Raymond Harmon was remarrying, and his family wanted Patricia there to watch it happen. He smiled through 3 days of testimony, because he thought his wife had no proof left. Then her lawyer opened one envelope, and everything he built on lies collapsed in under 5 minutes. Not because he was nervous, not because he was afraid. He truly believed the woman he once promised to love had finally run out of proof. For months, Daniel Mercer had called her bitter. He had called her desperate. He had told anyone willing to listen that Claire Whitmore was a woman consumed by her own anger, a woman who could not accept that the life they once shared was over. He sat in that courtroom, with his shoulders back and his jaw relaxed, like a man who already knew the outcome of a story that had not yet finished being told. And when Rebecca Hayes, Claire's attorney, placed that sealed envelope on the judge's bench, Daniel leaned over to his own lawyer and whispered something that made both of them smile. When the judge unfolded the paper inside that envelope, the smile on Daniel Mercer's face disappeared before anyone said a word. It did not fade slowly. It did not shift into confusion or concern. It simply vanished, the way a light goes out when the power is cut, sudden and complete. The courtroom, which had been restless and murmuring for 3 days, went absolutely still. Claire Whitmore sat on the other side of the room, with her hands folded in her lap, and she did not look at Daniel when it happened. She looked at the floor, because she had not come to that courtroom to watch him fall. She had come because the truth deserved to be spoken out loud, even if it took years for anyone to finally listen. What was inside that envelope that made a confident man lose everything in less than 5 minutes? To understand what happened in that courtroom, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the day the lawyers filed their papers, not to the night Claire first realized something in her marriage had changed forever. You have to go back further than that, to the version of Daniel Mercer that almost nobody in that courtroom had ever seen. The version who sat across from a young woman at a corner table in a small restaurant in Columbus, Ohio, with holes in the soles of his shoes and a borrowed jacket, telling her that one day he was going to be someone she would be proud to stand beside. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The question this story is really asking is not a legal one. It is not about statutes or evidence thresholds or what a judge can or cannot rule. The question this story is asking is far older than any courtroom. Why did Daniel Mercer smile through 3 days of testimony? What did he believe Claire could never prove? Why did she stay silent for so long before she finally allowed Rebecca Hayes to do what Rebecca Hayes had been quietly preparing to do for months? And what was buried inside that final envelope that Daniel had convinced himself was impossible? This is not just a court case, it is the ending of a love story. And love stories, even the ones that end in betrayal, always begin somewhere ordinary. Claire Whitmore grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the second of 3 daughters in a family that did not have much, but never made her feel the absence of wealth. Her mother worked in a school cafeteria for 22 years. Her father drove a delivery route 6 days a week. They were quiet people, the kind who paid their bills on time and kept their word, and believed deeply that a person's character was the only currency that truly lasted. Claire inherited that belief completely. She was not the loudest person in any room she entered, but she was the kind of person other people trusted without fully understanding why. She listened carefully. She kept confidences. She noticed when someone was struggling before they said a word about it. Those qualities would eventually be the reason Daniel Mercer pursued her, with the kind of intention that felt, at the time, like devotion. They met in the fall of 2007, at a community event in Columbus. Daniel was 26 years old, working 2 jobs and taking night classes in business administration. He was charming, in the specific way that certain ambitious men are charming. Not flashy, not loud, but focused in a way that made you feel like the most important person in the room, when his attention landed on you. He told Claire that night that he had a plan, that he could see exactly where he was going, and that the only thing standing between him and that future was time. Claire listened to him talk for almost 2 hours. She drove home that night and told her older sister that she had just met someone different. Her sister asked what made him different. Claire thought about it and said he actually meant what he said. That distinction, in her mind, was everything. Daniel did mean what he said, at least in the beginning. He called when he said he would call. He showed up when he made plans. He worked with a discipline that Claire respected genuinely, not romantically, the way you respect someone who refuses to let circumstances decide their ceiling. They began spending more time together, and within 6 months, Claire had become not just his girlfriend, but the person he thought out loud with, the person he called at 11 at night when a business idea would not leave him alone, the person he ran calculations by and asked for honest feedback. She gave it to him honestly every time. She did not tell him what he wanted to hear. She told him what she actually thought, and rather than resenting that, Daniel, at that stage in his life, seemed to genuinely need it. By 2009, they were living together in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Columbus, with a broken heating vent in the hallway and a neighbor who played music until 2 in the morning. Claire was working as an office coordinator at a small logistics company. Daniel was still in school, still working, still grinding towards something he could not fully name yet, but could feel clearly enough to keep moving toward it every day. Those were not easy years financially, but Claire would later describe them as some of the most honest years of her life. Because in that apartment, with that broken vent and that loud neighbor, there was nothing performative about anything they did. They were simply 2 people trying to build something together, and the togetherness felt real. In the summer of 2010, Claire found out she was pregnant. She was 30 years old. Daniel was 29. They had talked about children in the abstract, the way young couples do when the future still feels like a country they have not yet entered. But this was no longer abstract. Claire sat on the edge of the bathtub and held the test in both hands and felt something she could not organize into a single emotion. She was scared and hopeful and uncertain all at the same time. When she told Daniel that evening, he was quiet for longer than felt comfortable. Then he sat down beside her and said something that stayed with her for years afterward. He said, "This is going to make me work harder. Not I am happy. Not I am scared." He said, "This is going to make me work harder." Claire heard that as commitment. She heard it as love expressed in the language of a man who showed his feelings through action rather than words. She would not understand until much later what that sentence had actually revealed about him. Their son, Ethan, was born in April of 2011. He was a quiet baby with dark eyes and Daniel's sharp jaw, and Claire's patience already visible in the way he studied the world around him, without immediately reacting to it. Daniel held him in the hospital and looked down at him with an expression that Claire read as wonder. She photographed that moment. She kept that photograph for years. It would eventually end up in a document that Rebecca Hayes submitted to the court, not for sentimental reasons, but as part of a timeline that told a very different story than the one Daniel would insist on telling under oath. The changes began slowly. The way water damages a wall. You do not see the problem forming. You only notice it once the surface finally gives way. Daniel finished his degree in 2011 and took a position at a mid-sized investment management firm in Columbus. He was good at the work. He was exceptionally good at reading people, at understanding what they wanted to hear, and giving it to them in a way that felt earned rather than calculated. Within 2 years, he had been promoted twice. He began making more money than either of them had imagined in that apartment with the broken vent, and Claire watched him grow into this version of himself with genuine pride. She had believed in him before his name meant anything to anyone. Watching the world begin to recognize what she had always seen felt, for a while, like confirmation that her faith had been well placed. But the same success that Claire had quietly helped make possible began to put distance between them in ways she could not initially name. Daniel started coming home later. He began taking calls in other rooms and closing the door. He stopped asking for her opinion the way he once had, not because he had stopped valuing her perspective, but because he had surrounded himself with people paid to validate rather than challenge. He grew quieter at home and louder in public. And the quietness at home was not the comfortable silence of two people who know each other deeply. It was the silence of a man who had begun to live in a version of his life that did not fully include her. Claire noticed. She said nothing at first, because she told herself it was the pressure of the new role. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself the man she had sat with in that apartment, the man who called her at 11 at night to think out loud, was still in there somewhere. He proposed in the fall of 2013. It surprised her, not because she had not hoped for it, but because the distance she had been feeling made the gesture feel slightly misaligned, like a sentence that started in one direction and ended somewhere unexpected. She said yes. They married in June of 2014, in a ceremony that was simple by the standards Daniel's income could now afford. Claire had wanted something small. Daniel, for the first time, agreed with her on something, without pushing for more. She remembered feeling relieved by that. She remembered thinking maybe the version of Daniel she had first fallen in love with was finding his way back. She was wrong. The marriage formalized something that had already been in motion for years. Daniel did not become crueler overnight. He became increasingly absent in the way that is harder to confront than overt cruelty, because absence leaves no bruise you can point to. He stopped including Claire in conversations about his work, his finances, his future plans. He set up accounts she did not have access to. When she asked questions, he answered with brevity, designed to end the conversation rather than continue it. He began to rewrite the narrative of his success in social situations, referring to himself as self-made in ways that technically omitted the years when Claire's income had kept them stable while he was still building. He did not lie outright. He simply stopped mentioning her contributions, and in the silence around those contributions, the erasure began. There was a night in the winter of 2018 when Claire could not sleep, and she went to the kitchen and sat at the table without turning on the overhead light. She sat in the yellow edge of the light coming through the window from the street, and she did not cry, which was not because she had nothing to cry about, but because she had passed the stage of grief where crying felt like it accomplished anything. She had been sitting with the knowledge of what her marriage had become for long enough that the feeling had moved past sharp and settled into something dull and constant, the way a fracture becomes part of the body rather than an event that happens to it. She had a folder on the kitchen table that she had pulled from the cabinet in the hallway, and inside it were documents from the early years, the apartment lease with both their names on it, a bank statement from 2009 showing a shared account with a balance of $412, a photograph of Daniel at his graduation ceremony, with Claire's hand visible at the edge of the frame because she had been the one standing beside him when someone else took the picture. She looked at those documents for a long time in the yellow streetlight, not to remind herself of what she had lost, but to confirm that it had been real. Because one of the specific cruelties of being with a person who rewrites history is that you begin, after long enough, to question your own memory. You begin to wonder if your recollection of the sacrifice and the partnership and the particular texture of those early years is accurate, or whether you have softened it the way people soften photographs, smoothing out what was actually ordinary into something that only looks significant in retrospect. The documents answered that question without sentiment. The lease was real. The $412 was real. The hand at the edge of the graduation photograph was real. Claire had been there. She had been present for every year of the story Daniel was now telling without her in it, and no amount of retroactive revision could change what the paperwork said. She put the documents back in the folder and went to check on Ethan, which was something she did most nights, even when he was sleeping soundly, not out of anxiety, but out of the specific need that certain mothers have to confirm that the thing they are fighting for is still there and still whole. He was asleep on his side, with one arm hanging off the edge of the mattress the way he always slept, deeply and without apparent concern for the world. She stood in his doorway for a moment. Then she went back to bed. She did not have a plan yet. She did not know about Rebecca Hayes yet. She did not know about the envelope. She only knew that the man who had looked at this child in a hospital room with something close to wonder had become someone she no longer recognized, and that she was going to have to decide what to do about that before the decision was made for her. Ethan was 5 years old when his father first made him feel invisible. It was not a dramatic moment. It was a dinner party at a colleague's home where Daniel introduced himself and Claire, and then pivoted away from Ethan's presence in a way that made other guests unsure whether the child in the room belonged to him. Claire noticed. Ethan was too young to name what he had felt, but he had felt it. Children always do. In the years that followed, Daniel's relationship with Ethan grew increasingly transactional. He remembered birthdays when it was convenient. He attended school events when they aligned with his schedule. He provided financially in ways that satisfied a minimum threshold while maintaining emotional distance that told a different story entirely. Claire held the family together with a consistency that exhausted her, because she kept believing the turning point was coming, kept believing that the man who had looked at Ethan in that hospital room with something close to wonder would eventually find his way back to his son. There was a Thursday evening in October of 2017 that Claire never fully let go of. Not because it was the worst thing Daniel ever did, but because it was the moment she understood that the damage was no longer only between the two of them. Ethan's school had organized a father-son science showcase, the kind of event that fills a gymnasium with folding tables and poster boards and children who have spent 2 weeks preparing something they want to show their fathers specifically. Ethan had built a model of the solar system out of painted foam balls and wire, and he had practiced his explanation of it 4 times in the living room the week before, standing straight with his hands behind his back, the way Claire had seen him do when he was trying to appear older than he was. He had texted Daniel the date 3 weeks in advance. Daniel had said he would be there. Daniel was not there. He sent a message at 6:47 in the evening, 14 minutes after the showcase began, saying a client dinner had run longer than expected, and he would make it up to Ethan on the weekend. Claire read the message standing near the gym entrance and made a decision in that moment not to tell Ethan right away. She walked back to his table and stood beside him and listened to him explain the orbital periods of the planets to 2 other parents who had wandered over, and she watched his eyes drift to the gymnasium door every few minutes with the particular hope that children carry before they learn to protect themselves from disappointment. By the time the showcase ended, Ethan had stopped looking at the door. He helped Claire carry the solar system to the car, without asking where his father was. He did not ask that night. He did not ask the next morning. He simply stopped mentioning the showcase entirely, and that silence was the thing that broke something in Claire that no argument with Daniel ever had. The weekend came. Daniel did not make it up to Ethan. There was another reason, another obligation, another layer of the life he was building that consistently had less room in it than the life he was leaving behind. Claire watched her son recalibrate quietly, the way children do when they begin to understand that certain people cannot be relied upon, that the solution is not to want less, but to expect less, which is a crueler lesson than any parent should have to watch a child learn before he is old enough to drive. Ethan was 6 years old when he stopped saving a seat for his father at school events. 6 years old, and Daniel, who had signed a document in 2012 confirming beyond any reasonable doubt that this child was his, continued to move through his increasingly polished life, as if the boy sitting at that gymnasium table with a foam solar system and a practiced explanation had nothing particular to do with him. The turning point came. It just was not the one Claire had been waiting for. In early 2019, Claire discovered that Daniel had been involved with another woman for at least 2 years. She did not find out through a dramatic confrontation or a careless phone left unlocked. She found out through a conversation with a woman named Sandra, the wife of one of Daniel's colleagues, who assumed Claire already knew because, as Sandra put it, it had not exactly been a secret in certain circles. Claire sat with that information for 3 days before she said a word to Daniel. When she finally brought it to him, his response confirmed everything she had feared about who he had become. He did not apologize. He did not deny it with the desperation of someone afraid of losing her. He looked at her with a calm that bordered on boredom and said, "We have not been a real marriage for a long time, Claire." She said, "We have a son." He said, "I know that." She filed for separation in March of 2019. Daniel responded through his attorney. That was the first time Claire understood the scale of what she was facing, because the attorney Daniel hired was not a family law generalist. He was a litigator with a specific reputation for protecting wealthy clients from financial exposure in divorce proceedings. His name was Grant Whitfield, and within 2 weeks of his engagement, he had sent Claire's then-attorney a document that made 3 central claims. First, that Daniel and Claire's marriage had been characterized by limited financial partnership, meaning Daniel had built his wealth largely independently of Claire's contributions. Second, that Ethan's paternity was a matter Daniel wished to address formally through the court. And third, that Claire's claims regarding marital assets were overstated and would not survive evidentiary scrutiny. The document arrived on a Tuesday. Claire's attorney at the time, a soft-spoken family law practitioner named Gerald Moore, who had been practicing in Columbus for 30 years, called her before he sent it over and said he wanted her to be sitting down when she read it. She was already sitting down. She was at the kitchen table, the same table where she had sat in the yellow light the winter before, and she had her coffee in front of her, and she read the 3 claims in Grant Whitfield's letter with the careful attention she gave to everything she needed to fully understand before she responded to it. The first claim she read and felt a flare of anger that she managed without difficulty. The second claim she read and felt the anger sharpen into something more focused. The third claim, the paternity question, she read twice. Then she set the document down and looked at the wall for a long time. She was not confused by it. That was the specific cruelty of the moment. If she had been confused, if she had experienced even a second of genuine uncertainty about what Daniel's claim meant or why he was making it, the feeling would have been different. But she was not confused. She understood exactly what the document meant. It meant that Daniel had looked at his 8-year-old son, a child he had held in a hospital room, a child he had watched grow up in a house he shared with that child's mother, a child whose face contained his own jawline and his own dark eyes, and had decided to use that child as a legal instrument. Not because he had any genuine doubt, but because introducing doubt was strategically useful. Because if he could force Claire to prove the obvious, he could exhaust her energy, her financial resources, and her emotional reserves before the larger questions about marital assets ever came before a judge. He was using Ethan the way you use a procedural motion, not because it had merit, but because it had cost. Claire sat at that kitchen table for a long time after she read the document. At some point, she became aware that her coffee had gone cold. She picked it up anyway, and held it in both hands, the way she had held things when she needed something to hold. And she thought about the 8-year-old boy upstairs, who did not know that his father had just submitted a legal document, suggesting he might not be his father's son. She thought about the day that information would reach Ethan, in whatever form it eventually reached him, and what he would make of it, and what kind of mother she needed to be between now and then to ensure he had enough foundation under him to absorb it without being destroyed by it. She called Gerald Moore back. She told him she wanted to find a different attorney, not because Gerald had done anything wrong, but because what Daniel had just done required a response that went beyond what Gerald's practiced. Reasonable approach was designed to deliver. She needed someone who understood that this was no longer a separation proceeding. It was a statement of intent, and it required an equally clear statement in return. Claire read those 3 claims and felt something shift inside her. Not collapse, shift, because the third point she could dispute with records she had kept carefully over the years. The first point she could contest with testimony and documentation that told the true story of those early years. But the second point, the question of Ethan's paternity, reached her in a place that no legal argument could adequately describe. Ethan was 8 years old. He was Daniel's biological son. Claire had never doubted it for a single second, and Daniel knew that too, which meant the paternity claim was not a matter of genuine uncertainty. It was a weapon. It was Daniel using his own child as a legal instrument to complicate the proceedings and exhaust Claire emotionally before they ever reached a courtroom. And that was the moment, sitting at her kitchen table with those documents in her hand, that Claire Whitmore decided she was not going to accept a settlement. She was going to let this go to trial. Because what Daniel had just done to Ethan deserved to be spoken out loud in a room with a judge and a record. She found Rebecca Hayes through a referral from a legal aid organization. Rebecca was 44 years old, a former prosecutor who had transitioned into family law after spending a decade watching institutional power protect the wrong people. She was not flashy. She did not have a large firm behind her, What she had was a method that opponents consistently underestimated, because she appeared, on the surface, to be building a conventional case right up until the moment she was not. She met Claire 3 times before she agreed to take the case. On the 3rd meeting, she asked Claire one question. Is there anything about your relationship with Daniel, any period of time, any document, any conversation, that you have not told me? Claire thought about it, and then told Rebecca about a medical appointment from 2012. Rebecca sat very still while Claire explained. Then she asked Claire if she still had the paperwork from that appointment. Claire said she had kept everything. Rebecca said, "Then we are going to be fine." The trial began in October of 2021. Daniel arrived each morning in a dark suit with Grant Whitfield at his side, and the confidence he projected was not performed. It was genuine, because Daniel had spent 2 years building a legal strategy designed to make Claire look like a woman pursuing a grievance rather than a woman pursuing the truth. Whitfield opened by characterizing the marriage as a union that had run its course between 2 people with different values, in which Daniel had been the primary earner and decision-maker, and Claire had been a supportive but largely non-contributing spouse who now sought to profit from Daniel's independent success. He was measured, he was credible, and he used the word independent 11 times in his opening statement, because repetition is not always a literary device. Sometimes, it is a legal one. Rebecca Hayes opened quietly. She told the court that this case was about one central question: whether a man who had benefited from a woman's trust, labor, and sacrifice for over a decade was entitled to rewrite that history the moment it became financially inconvenient. She told the court that the evidence would show Daniel Mercer had not built anything independently. He had built it alongside a woman he was now attempting to erase. And she told the court that one piece of evidence in particular would clarify everything the defense was going to spend 3 days trying to obscure. She did not say what that evidence was. She did not describe the envelope. She simply said, "By the time this trial is finished, this court will have no uncertainty about who Daniel Mercer is, and what he knew, and when he knew it." The first 2 days of trial went largely as Daniel and Whitfield had constructed them to go. Financial records were presented that showed Daniel's assets were concentrated in accounts opened after 2013. Expert witnesses testified that Claire's contributions to their household could not be classified as financial partnership in any meaningful legal sense. Character witnesses described Daniel as a disciplined professional who had sacrificed personal comfort for years to build a legitimate career. Whitfield moved through his case with the quiet confidence of a man trimming excess from a budget, removing anything that might complicate the picture he was painting. And the picture was effective. Several observers who attended the trial told journalists afterward that by the end of the 2nd day, they had believed Claire was going to lose. On the 3rd day, Daniel took the stand. Whitfield walked him through his testimony with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every question and every answer until there was no variation left. Daniel spoke about the marriage as a genuine partnership in the emotional sense, but a separate one in the financial sense. He spoke about Ethan with carefully calibrated language, designed to signal concern without conceding anything. He described the paternity claim as a matter he raised not out of malice, but out of a sincere desire for legal clarity, given, as he put it, the complexity of the relationship in its later years. He was convincing, he was calm, and used the word transparency 6 times, which is the specific word people use when they are being deliberately opaque. Then Rebecca Hayes stood up for cross-examination. She did not attack Daniel directly. She asked him a series of questions that appeared, on the surface, to be clarifying points, small verifications of timeline and detail that Whitfield did not object to because they seemed harmless. She asked Daniel to confirm the date he had started his position at the investment firm. He confirmed it. She asked him to confirm the date he and Claire had moved out of their apartment on the east side of Columbus. He confirmed it. She asked him to confirm that Ethan had been born in April of 2011. He confirmed it, adding that this was precisely why he had raised the paternity question, because the timeline of the relationship had been irregular. Rebecca thanked him. Then she asked him one final question. Had Daniel ever, at any point prior to the commencement of these legal proceedings, obtained any medical or genetic information pertaining to Ethan's biological parentage? Daniel said no. He said it clearly and without hesitation. He said he had no such information and had never sought it. Rebecca said, "Thank you," and she sat down. Whitfield moved immediately to close the evidentiary phase. He told the judge that the defense had presented a complete record and was prepared for final arguments. The judge, Honorable Thomas Caldwell, asked if the plaintiff had any remaining submissions. Rebecca stood and said yes. One final submission, if the court would permit. Whitfield started to object on procedural grounds, but Caldwell, a man who had spent 23 years on the bench and had seen every variety of courtroom theater, asked Rebecca to approach. She handed him the envelope. It was sealed with a certification label from a genetic testing laboratory. Caldwell examined the exterior, confirmed the chain of custody documentation attached to it, and overruled the objection. He asked the bailiff to open the envelope and hand him the contents. The courtroom was completely silent. Whitfield leaned over to Daniel and said something low and quick. Daniel shook his head, and for the first time in 3 days, the confidence in his posture shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough. The way a building shifts before a structural failure. Imperceptible to most people, but visible to anyone who has been trained to look for it. Claire sat on the other side of the room with Rebecca beside her, and she did not look at Daniel. She had decided weeks earlier that she would not look at him in that moment, because the moment was not about him. It had never been about him, not really. It was about Ethan, who was now 10 years old, and sitting with Claire's sister in the hallway outside the courtroom, because Claire had not wanted him inside. Judge Caldwell read the contents of the envelope in silence first. Then he read the relevant section aloud for the record. The document inside that envelope was a certified DNA analysis from a licensed genetic testing laboratory. The test had been conducted in 2012, 9 years before the trial, on samples provided voluntarily by Claire and Daniel at a private medical facility in Columbus. The results confirmed, with a statistical certainty of 99.97%, that Daniel Mercer was the biological father of Ethan Whitmore. The document bore Daniel's signature on the consent form. It bore the date. It bore the facility's certification stamp. Daniel had known since 2012 that Ethan was his son, not as a matter of legal probability, but as a matter of documented biological fact. He had signed the paperwork himself. He had seen the results himself. And then, 9 years later, he had stood in a court of law and told a judge and a record that he had never obtained any medical or genetic information pertaining to Ethan's parentage. Daniel Mercer had not just denied his son, he had denied him under oath. The silence in the courtroom lasted long enough that it stopped being silence and became something else entirely, something heavier. Judge Caldwell set the document down and looked at Daniel over the top of his reading glasses with an expression that required no translation. Grant Whitfield requested a recess. Caldwell denied it. He asked Daniel's attorney if his client wished to amend any portion of his earlier testimony. Whitfield said he needed time to consult. Caldwell told him the court would take a 15-minute recess. That was all. Claire stood in the hallway during those 15 minutes. Her sister was sitting with Ethan near the window at the end of the corridor, and Ethan was doing what he always did in waiting situations, reading quietly, absorbed in something that had nothing to do with the world around him. Claire watched him from a distance and felt the specific grief that belongs only to mothers who have fought battles their children do not yet fully understand. She had not started this fight for money, though the financial stakes were real. She had not started it for reputation, though Daniel had spent years undermining hers. She had started it because Ethan was 10 years old and had spent a meaningful portion of his life feeling like an inconvenience to his own father, and that feeling had been manufactured deliberately by a man who knew, from a document he had signed with his own hand, that Ethan was his. When the court reconvened, Daniel's demeanor had changed completely. The calm was gone. The precise posture was gone. He sat with his attorney and he looked, for the first time in the entire proceeding, like a man who understood what he had done. Not remorseful, not yet, but aware that the envelope had contained the one piece of evidence that his entire strategy had depended on remaining sealed. What he had not accounted for was that Claire had kept the paperwork from that 2012 appointment in a fireproof box in her mother's home in Dayton for 9 years. Not because she had anticipated a trial, but because Claire Whitmore was the kind of person who kept records the way her parents had kept their word, carefully and without drama, because you never know when the truth is going to need something to stand on. Rebecca Hayes delivered her closing argument with the measured precision of someone who did not need volume to be heard. She told the court that the evidence before it established 2 things clearly. First, that Claire Whitmore had been a foundational partner in the years during which Daniel Mercer built the career that generated the assets now in dispute. Second, that Daniel Mercer had filed a paternity claim in legal proceedings while in possession of a certified document proving biological paternity, and had subsequently testified under oath that no such document existed. She asked the court to consider both the financial claims and the implications of testimony that could only be described as false. She sat down without theatrics, without crescendo, because the document had already said everything that needed to be said. Judge Caldwell's ruling came the following morning. He found that Claire's contributions to the early years of the partnership were legally cognizable and entitled her to a significant share of the marital assets. He found that Daniel's paternity claim had been filed without good faith basis, given the existence of the 2012 documentation, and he awarded Ethan formal legal recognition as Daniel's biological son with corresponding financial obligations. He referred the matter of Daniel's trial testimony to the appropriate authorities for review, noting that the court had recorded testimony that appeared to contradict documentary evidence submitted under certified chain of custody. He did not use the word perjury in his ruling. He did not need to. Everyone in that courtroom understood what the referral meant. Daniel said nothing when the ruling was read. He gathered his papers and left the courtroom with Grant Whitfield walking slightly ahead of him, and neither of them spoke to any of the journalists who had assembled in the corridor. Someone who had been in the courtroom described his expression as that of a man who had prepared extensively for a version of events that no longer existed. That was a charitable description. Claire walked out of the courtroom with Rebecca Hayes beside her and stopped in the corridor to breathe. Her sister met her halfway down the hall. Ethan was there. He looked up at his mother and asked if it was over. She said yes. He asked if they had won. She thought about how to answer that for a moment, and then she said they had told the truth, and that was what they had come to do. Ethan nodded as if that was sufficient, because in the way children sometimes understand things more clearly than adults, it was. Daniel approached them as they were preparing to leave. Claire saw him coming, and she did not tense. She did not prepare an argument. She waited. He stood a few feet away and said her name. Then, he said he was sorry. He said it quietly, not for the room, not for the journalists, just the 2 words themselves, delivered in the particular register of a man who has finally lost the ability to perform confidence. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Then she said she knew. She picked up her bag and she walked toward the exit with her son beside her. She did not look back. She did not look back because there was nothing behind her worth returning to. The man she had loved in that small apartment, the one who called her at 11 at night to think out loud, the one who said, "This is going to make me work harder," when he found out Ethan was coming. That man had made choices that could not be unmade, not by an apology in a courthouse hallway, not by a judicial ruling, not by anything that could happen now, after a decade of deliberate erasure. The love had been real. The betrayal had also been real. And the truth, sealed inside an envelope for 9 years, had been real too. What the courtroom had done was not restore something that had been taken. It had simply insisted, finally, that the record reflect what had actually happened. Ethan learned the full details of the trial gradually, as children do, not all at once but in pieces, over conversations with his mother that stretched across months. He was not angry in the explosive way that certain betrayals produce in young people. He was quiet about it, in the way he had always been quiet, processing it through the particular patience that had been visible in him since he was a newborn studying the ceiling of a hospital room. He asked his mother once, about a year after the trial, why his father had done it, why he had denied him. Claire sat with that question for a long time before she answered. She told him that sometimes people make themselves smaller to protect something they value more. and that his father had made the mistake of deciding that the thing most worth protecting was not the people who loved him, but the image of himself he wanted the world to believe. Ethan said, "So it was never about me." Claire said no, it was always about him, and that distinction, painful as it was also the thing that set Ethan free from carrying a question that had never been his to answer. Rebecca Hayes submitted her final billing statement 3 weeks after the ruling. It was reasonable, far more reasonable than Daniel's legal costs, which turned out to have been substantial enough to require him to liquidate one of the investment accounts that Whitfield had spent 3 days insisting Claire had no claim to. There was a particular symmetry in that outcome that Claire noticed without commenting on. Some forms of justice are elegant enough to speak for themselves. Daniel's professional reputation did not collapse overnight. It eroded. The referral from Judge Caldwell's courtroom took time to move through the appropriate channels, and in the interim, Daniel remained employed and publicly composed. But the story of the sealed envelope had been noted by enough people in enough rooms that his name carried a different weight than it once had. He was still capable. He was still skilled at the work. But the version of himself he had spent years constructing, the self-made man, the disciplined professional, the independent success story, that version required a particular kind of audience, one that had not been present in courtroom 7, when Thomas Caldwell read the contents of that envelope aloud. The audience he now faced knew the part of the story he had hoped to keep sealed. Some people do not betray you because they forgot what you did for them. They betray you because remembering it would force them to admit who they really became. Daniel Mercer had not forgotten what Claire did for those years in that apartment with the broken vent and the loud neighbor. He had remembered it precisely, and he had understood that remembering it out loud would mean acknowledging that the story of his success was not a solo performance. It was a collaboration, and the version of Daniel who needed to believe he had built everything alone could not survive that acknowledgement. So he tried to seal it the same way Claire's attorney had sealed that envelope, hoping it would never be opened. The difference was that what Rebecca Hayes carried to the bench was the truth, and what Daniel had tried to bury was the same. Claire Whitmore moved to a smaller house outside Columbus in the spring of 2022. It had a porch that faced east, and a yard that needed attention, and a neighborhood that reminded her, in its quietness, of the one she had grown up in. She and Ethan settled into it, the way people settle into spaces that ask nothing of them except their presence. She went back to work full-time. She reconnected with friends she had neglected during the long years of the marriage and the longer years of the legal battle. She did not date, not immediately, not because she had given up on love, but because she was relearning what it felt like to trust her own instincts again, to rebuild confidence in her ability to read a person correctly before she gave them access to anything that mattered. Ethan joined the school soccer team that fall and turned out to be genuinely good at it. In the unhurried, patient way he did most things, not the fastest, not the loudest, but consistent, in a way that coaches notice eventually. He visited his father twice in the year following the trial. The visits were cordial and brief. Daniel did not try to explain himself during those visits. He was, to his marginal credit, present in a way that he had not been before. Not warmly present, not naturally present, but trying in the visible, effortful way of someone who has lost the ease of connection and is working from a script instead. Ethan tolerated it without enthusiasm. He was old enough to know that you cannot rebuild with someone what was never fully built to begin with. But he was also young enough and generous enough to leave the door slightly open. Not because his father deserved it, because Ethan had inherited his mother's belief that people are not always the worst version of what they have done. The sealed envelope was never a dramatic object in the way that courtroom stories sometimes require their central symbols to be. It was a standard 9x12 manila envelope with a certification label and a chain of custody form attached. Rebecca Hayes had carried it in her leather portfolio for 6 months before the trial began, waiting for the specific moment when its contents would matter most, which was not the moment Daniel could be confronted with the facts, but the moment he had committed himself, under oath, to denying them. That was the education in watching Rebecca work. She had not been building to an accusation. She had been building to a contradiction. The contradiction was what mattered. The contradiction was the thing that could not be explained away, or reframed, or attributed to selective memory. The contradiction was Daniel, in his own voice, saying something that a signed document from 9 years earlier proved was false. Do you think Claire should have forgiven Daniel after the truth came out, or was walking away the only justice left? Leave your answer in the comments below, and tell us what you would have done in Claire's position. This is exactly the kind of story that stays with you, and we want to hear your thoughts. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Like this video, and subscribe to this channel for more emotional true-style stories about love, betrayal, family secrets, and the moment truth finally speaks.